welcome to the Friday show brought to you by the Jockey Club. Save the date, August 3rd. It's a Thursday this year for the Jockey Club Roundtable. Always interesting topics covered. If you're not in Saratoga Springs, you can watch it streamed live on the internet. I'm Ray Paulick with Joe Nevills, bloodstock editor of the Paulick Report. We are really pleased to be joined by Dr. Tim Parkin. Dr. Parkin is head of the Bristol Veterinary School in England, completed his PhD studies on the epidemiology of fractures of racehorses more than 20 years ago, and currently works with organizations around the world providing data-driven guidance on issues related to the horse, the welfare and health of horses. One of those organizations is the Jockey Club, which started the Equine Injury Database in 2008. And Dr. Parkin has been part of that. We're really grateful that you took the time to join us this week. Dr. Parkin, thanks very much.
No problem. Great to join you, Ray and Joe.
So just for the benefit of those who don't know a lot about the Equine Injury Database, why was it started and what's the mission and what kind of data is actually collected? So
the EID was one of the key initiatives that came out of the inaugural Safety of the Racehorse Summit in 2006. It was recognized that there wasn't a uniform national recording system for injuries, whether they be fatal or not, in North America at all. And actually that made it very difficult to then identify horses that might be at greater risk of injury or fatality, and indeed do any benchmarking and understand exactly what the size of the national problem and concern was. So it was one of the key initiatives that came out of that initial summit. The Jockey Club, via a couple of subsidiaries, Technology Services and Encompass, developed EID to start recording on a voluntary basis from individual racetracks injury data that could then be essentially tied to racing performance data to understand the outcomes that were occurring on a more comprehensive national level. The mission is, there are several missions really, but the first and important thing is to understand exactly what the size of any problem is, and actually record the injuries accurately, be able to quality assure them, understand what type of injuries there are that are occurring on different tracks. And then really the second one, once you've done enough of that, and you've got sufficient data, you can then start to use the data to identify risk factors. So what are the individual predispositions that increase the likelihood of a horse ending up with a fatal or non-fatal injury? And then really also, and I think this is really important, it serves as a resource to people like myself to conduct continued research into this area. As you said, I did my PhD more than 20 years ago. I've been lucky enough to stay in this particular field of research as an epidemiologist. And it's taken me all over the world. I work with multiple racing jurisdictions around the world. But the key thing is, every racing jurisdiction has data now. And as long as you can tie that to a reliable, quality assured injury database as well, you have the opportunity to address individual racing jurisdictions' welfare concerns. And that's really the beauty of the vision of the EID. And just to give you an idea of the scope of it now, we in the current database, we get an update every year from the Jockey Club. We have more than 4.5 million race starts and 8.5 million training events recorded in that database. So it's now an enormous database that essentially gives us a very good idea and indication of what the horses are doing with respect to their exercise history, but then, as I said, importantly, some valid, important QA related outcome data so that we can then model and understand which horses are of greater risk.
So that's an incredible amount of data. We're talking over the course of well over a decade at this point. What are some of the primary risk factors that have been identified, and what have we learned from all this data being collected?
So if we think about risk factors, I think it's important. There's a vast array of risk factors that we get from this, and one of the not problems, but one of the issues we get with so much data is that actually what you end up doing, you have what we call enormous amount of statistical power. So actually you're identifying very small size effects. So you end up with lots and lots of risk factors being identified. And one of the key challenges is actually to identify those that are presenting the greatest risk and potentially associated with the greatest outcome in terms of likelihood of injury, and sifting through the weeds and working out which are most likely to be modifiable, I guess. So actually you can do something about it. So if we think about horse level risk factors for a start, there are some things in there that clearly aren't modifiable, but they're still important to be aware of so that you can kind of risk profile individual horses. So age of the horse is an important thing. So generally, the older the horse, then the slightly greater risk of a horse ending up with a fatal injury. And we'd suggest that's to do with accumulation of pathology, etc. But interestingly, age at first start is also almost always associated with the outcome. So the younger a horse starts racing, the better it is. So if you can get the horse racing as a 2-year-old, it predisposes the horse to essentially have stronger skeletal infrastructure, to muscles and bones in particular, for the rest of its career. So actually that is a really important risk factor, because if you can get them racing as 2-year-olds, that predisposes them to be safer for every single start going forward. Now we understand that clearly some horses can't race as 2-year-olds because they may have pathology, they may have injury, etc. So there could be the injury or the pathology that then is subsequently associated with the outcome. But we also know that there are some horses that just aren't quite ready to race as a 2-year-old, and they're slightly more backward. And those are horses that are genuinely more likely to end up with a fatal injury somewhere later on. Tied to all of that, things like being on the vet list. If a horse has ever been on the vet's list for whatever reason, it looks like it never comes back down to baseline in terms of risk. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there. Previous injuries, horses that have had previous injuries, they're more likely to have clearly another previous injury and another injury, and the risk of fatal injury goes up quite a lot. And the important thing there is that we're only recording in that data racetrack injuries, previous injuries. So if we were able to gather training injuries as well, our opportunity to be able to add to that information would be enormous. If you think about racetrack or race-related risk factors, then you talk about surface. Everyone knows about surface. Dirt is more risky than turf, which is more risky than synthetic. I think that's commonly known. Claiming races present a greater risk. And some of the best evidence we see around that is actually with the introduction of the void claim rule, where actually those tracks that introduced a void claim rule somewhere during the period that we're talking about, 2009 onwards, you saw quite a marked change in the risk at those individual tracks, because it changed decision making. It changed the way the claiming races were used. So that a really key example, a really good example of some of the work that we've done that showed that claiming races were important in terms of risk, and actually void claim rule managed to moderate that risk a bit, and then actually void claim rules have now become uniform. The other aspect that we haven't talked about is trainer, obviously, as well. Trainers have a massive influence on this. We know we haven't got the detail about exact training patterns that contribute to risk because it's not comprehensively recorded, and I can talk about that later. But what we do know is a horse, when it's changing trainer, if it changes trainer, its first race with a new trainer presents a greater risk. The longer a horse has been with the same trainer, its risk slowly declines. So a horse that is changing trainer multiple times, its kind of risk goes up again, comes down, up again, comes down. So that's not a good thing for any racehorse, because the trainer is picking up a horse that they know very little about, and they don't know much about the medical history. They don't know much about the previous veterinary intervention. So they're dealing with something that's an unknown quantity, and no wonder the risk is high for those individual horses.
Well, you mentioned a couple of changes that have been made as a result of the data, the voided claim rule, for example. I would think with HISA now sort of being the law of the land in the United States, it's going to be easier to take the data and move it into practical solutions, isn't it?
You'd really, really hope so. I think this is one of the real opportunities of HISA, to be able to demonstrate significant impact of some of the interventions on some race courses, such as the void claim rule. And actually, it's unavoidable. Data is data, and it's fact, essentially. You can demonstrate that there is an impact of some of these interventions. Other interventions we talk about, pre-race, determining that there must be pre-race examinations post certain number of days of layout, for example, those sort of things. Horses that have been off the track, if they come back from a vet list, they must have pre-race veterinary examinations, and they may actually have additional pre-race veterinary examinations. Those are things that are all going to contribute, and you'd hope that through the mechanism of HISA that actually they can be made regulations that can be made national and actually can have a much more significant impact on the overall North American incidence of fatal injuries across the board, rather than just relying on an individual state or an individual track to say, we're very interested in this, we've got a problem, we're going to do something about it at our local level. Actually, what really needs to happen is this has to be, on a national level to really start to break down that national picture and actually to start impacting across the board. It's really, really critical. I think what we've done since I started my PhD 20 plus years ago, that was all about identifying risk factors. Now what we're much more focused on is actually identifying the at-risk horse. And if you think of it like that, actually, what that means is we're actually looking at prediction. And prediction means prevention. And that's where these are a perfect example where prevention is better than cure. We know it's very difficult to fix these, fractures in horses. And actually, if you can prevent them happening at all, then that's how we're going to have impact. So really, but in order to be able to get to decent levels of prediction, actually what we need, I've already talked about the amount of data we have. We've got loads and loads of data. We don't need more data of the same data. Actually, what we need is novel data. What we need is comprehensive training data, and it has to, and by comprehensive, I mean covers every horse in the cohort. We can do a training model for a certain state if they mandate we have to return training information. But actually, if we want to do it nationally, then we have to have every horse covered. And these two that I'm going to talk about next are really, really tough. Veterinary histories and medication records. Understanding those, not just for individual horses entered into individual meets or anything like that, but across the board. We can't do anything with it unless we have it for every horse that is part of the EID and part of the national recording system. One of the few places where we are able to do that is Hong Kong. And we've got some work going with Hong Kong, and I just want to touch on this a little bit because I think it is important. They know pretty much what every horse does on every day of its life in Hong Kong. They've got the training data, they've got the medical history, they all, they're very well tightly controlled. Over the last 18 months, we've been doing very similar modeling to that which we do with the EID in Hong Kong. Whereas the predictive ability for some of the work that we do in North America is sort of circa 69, 70%. And essentially what that means is if you had two horses, one of which you knew was going to end up dead and one of which you knew was going to end up alive at the end of the race, our models in North America would get it correct about 70% of the time. Trouble is, you toss a coin, that's going to get it correct 50% of the time. So that is nowhere near accurate enough to implement in terms of regulation. The work we're doing in Hong Kong, because we know veterinary history, we know medical histories, etc., we're now hitting sort of 80, 85% predictability. And that's getting much closer to where we might be able to tell the pre-race veterinary examiner, the vets doing the pre-race exams, essentially say, okay, you've got a horse in front of you and you're unsure, have a look at the risk profile, the data-driven risk profile. If that comes out and that's indicating it's a red flag, maybe you'll make one decision. If it comes out, if the data is saying it's a green flag and it's really low risk, just because of its risk profile, maybe you'll make a different decision, you'll let the horse go. So we see that this sort of information not being a panacea, not being the single point of information that people would rely on. It just feeds into the vet trying to make a decision, a very difficult decision on the day about whether the horse should race or not. And we just see this as another tool that the clinician trying to make that decision, or the regulatory vet trying to make that decision, can feed into their decision-making process. And if we can get anything from Hong Kong that is proof of concept that then encourages other jurisdictions to make the effort to collect the training data, collect the veterinary histories, collect the medical records, then I think if they can see that there is a clear benefit to that, and I recognize it's a very difficult thing to do, then actually there's greater impetus to enable that to happen. And I'd hope that HISA in time would help that happen as well.
And that's something that I wanted to expand upon a little bit, is the sort of out of competition aspect of, collecting this data. What are some of the kind of, what are some of the challenges of getting that, taken care of? I imagine that, certain horsemen aren't going to be as willing to share their, training
No.
mishaps or just what their sort of secret sauce is more than others might.
And that's exactly the problem. It's almost the case that actually, and it happened in my PhD. Okay, I'll be honest here. During my PhD, we had cases we identified had a distal limb fracture, and then we asked those trainers about their history of their horses, and we also selected other horses from the same race. And we did telephone questionnaires, old-fashioned epidemiology of the horses that hadn't suffered race injuries in the same race. The control trainers, they were honest about lameness. The trainers who had a fracture, were they honest about lameness? Were they willing to admit that they had missed something? So it's very difficult. You're asking people to, they immediately become defensive, and that's understandable because you've lost a horse, and so it is very, very difficult to do. And it's almost like what you need to do, as we have race records are routinely recorded, they're part of the data. Actually, training records need to be routinely recorded, not just as a review of a set of fatal incidents, because that's when people become defensive. Just as routine recording, 5 years' time, everyone will forget that it happens all the time, but it just feeds into the data and it just adds more information. Now, that's about training. If you're talking about veterinary and medical histories, clearly we're talking about valuable horses. The confidentiality around those is really, really key. And, it can't be anonymous because we need to be able to trace back to the individual animals. But actually, we must be able to get to the situation where, because veterinary histories are so important in predicting risk and medication records are so important in predicting risk, we've got to get to the situation. If we're going to take the next level and the next big step here, we're making incremental advances. And we've seen a 38% reduction in the risk of fatal injury on North American racetracks since 2009. So we've had a significant impact. But if we're going to take the next big step, then actually it really does need a mindset change and an understanding that everyone has to pull together, and we have to do this for the good of the industry and try to put behind us what it might mean for the individual horse, for that particular horse, if you're disclosing veterinary histories and medical records, even on a confidential basis.
We've had a cluster at Churchill Downs of fatalities, which is one of the reasons we wanted to talk to you here. And it's happened before. It happened at Santa Anita a few years ago. It happened at Aqueduct. Is there anything in the data that explains why tracks have this? Or we had a reader ask us if, when tracks open up for the start of a season, do we generally see higher incidence of fatal injuries?
I'm not sure that we know for sure whether we do see higher instances of fatal injuries right at the start of seasons. It comes back to the issue, as I said at the beginning, you've got 4.5 million race starts. From that, we can produce good statistical evidence. We've got 4,500 fatal injuries over that period, whatever it happens to be. When you're trying to deal with identifying trends with just 12 fatalities, you're back to the situation where it's very, very difficult to pick anything out of that. You can look at individual horse profiles, then you have to look at all the horses in the same race, because that horse profile may just be a common horse profile, and you may just be spuriously identifying it associated with the outcome. So this is the very difficult part of what goes on when you do have these spikes at individual tracks. It's often very, very difficult to identify something from minute analysis, because unless there's something that's blindingly obvious that's gone wrong with the track or with the training or whatever it is, that blindingly obvious stuff doesn't need minute statistical analysis for it to appear. So it is quite difficult to do. We always look at, and I was engaged in some of the Santa Anita stuff, and I'm looking at some of the Churchill Downs stuff, but it's always very, very difficult to identify from what thankfully still is a relatively small number of horses. We're talking about 4,500 fatalities, whatever it is, since 2009, and 4.5 million starts. It's still a tiny number of horses, and actually to pull anything out of that is actually really, really difficult, unless there's something drastic that's gone wrong with training, medication, or the surface, for example. So it's not easy.
So you were talking earlier about just sort of the confidentiality of being able to report findings, especially in training, veterinary records, and my mind immediately went to stud value, because that's something that people are very protective of. You don't want people to, you don't want too much information to get out of there unless somebody thinks that your horse is unsound or, not, going to pass on bad genes. I know that there has been a little bit of discussion on looking at sire lines in relationship to horses in the EID. Has there been any progress at all in that and sort of finding specific bloodlines, pedigrees that might be susceptible to injury and or fatal injury?
So again, we have done some work on that, but to be honest, we always put sire into the models in a certain way that would enable us to identify if sire and indeed mare were associated with an elevated risk of the outcome. And they never come into the models. They're never strong enough in there as strong enough indicators. We haven't done heritability analysis on the EID data, but we did do that with Hong Kong and with UK about 5 to 10 years ago. And interestingly, the heritability of musculoskeletal injury seems to be relatively small. It's in the sort of 7-8% sort of margin. The only outcome we looked at that had a relatively high heritability in the 30+% was actually exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage. And that actually did seem to be much more heritable than the musculoskeletal injuries. Now, what that tells us is that actually there's relatively little inheritance and genetic component related to musculoskeletal injury, and it's far more related to what you do with the horse once it hits the ground. And actually the training regimes you put it under, you expose it to, how you treat it, veterinary and medical medications, etc., etc. So I don't think we're going to find a magic bullet, or we're going to find a particular line of sets of sires that are continually throwing horses that are at significantly greater risk. Yes, there will be variability, but I don't think it's something that we should really be looking to chase down, because I just don't think the evidence is there that there is good heritability for the majority of musculoskeletal injuries.
So just to be clear, when you're talking about heritability, you're talking about if the sire or dam had EIPH, had a musculoskeletal injury, the likelihood of the ensuing foal having a similar injury, like passing.
Well, it's to do with, are there clusters? So if you've got a sire that's had, I don't know, sort of 250 horses that have hit the track, are proportionally more of those 250 end up with a musculoskeletal injury than that sire A than sire B, who also has 250 horses that have hit the track. So It's about looking at the proportion of their progeny that end up with a particular outcome. So it's not about them having had the outcome and passing it on. It may just be that sire, they may have had the genes that predispose them to musculoskeletal injury, but their training was good. They weren't on the racetrack long enough to actually experience the musculoskeletal injury. We just don't know, because it is, thankfully, it's still quite a rare outcome. So it's about the proportion of progeny that end up with the outcome for individual sire lines and that sort of thing.
Gotcha.
Dr. Parkin, artificial intelligence has found its way into a lot of discussions and problem solving. Is there a place for AI in what you're doing right now, or in what the industry is trying to accomplish?
So it is interesting. So I had a PhD student who worked on EID data, who specifically was there to compare the efficacy of AI in terms of prediction and the efficacy of our traditional 100-year-old statistical model making that we do with statistics. And actually, in terms of predictability, there was no difference in the two at all. People do suggest that AI is going to be the panacea and it's going to solve everything. I've got issues with students here talking about using ChatGPT to do their exams and this sort of thing, but that's a different world. But the whole issue is that, again, it comes back to my point. Whatever technique you throw at it, we've already milked the current data to its extent. We're not going to get any more out of it. We're identifying minute risk factors in the new data. So what it really needs is that greater scope of data, greater width of data, new data being added into the databases. And this is nowhere near an issue that is only pertinent to North America. The British Horse Racing Authority are facing the same issues. Many jurisdictions around the world, they have the race data, they have the injury data, but then that's as far as they go. And before, as I said, we're not going to make the next step change until we acquire that additional data. So to answer your question, we're as good as AI. It's just we're stymied by the width of the data that we have, the scope of the data.
Well, listen, we appreciate all of the work that you've done with the Equine Injury Database and other projects to make racing as safe as possible. We've seen progress since the establishment of the Equine Injury Database. You said last year's numbers were the lowest, that we've seen in the United States. And we really appreciate all you've done there. And we thank you for joining us this week on the Friday show. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks, both.
And that's it for this week. Thanks to the Jockey Club for their sponsorship, and we'll see you next week.
Support award-winning independent horse industry journalism and become a Paulick Report Insider on Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, insiders get access to exclusive Q&As with Paulick Report staff, insight behind our editorial process, exclusive opinions and on-site analysis, Paulick Report merch, and more. This is not a paywall. The website you know and love will always be the same. But if you want more, and you want to make our coverage even better, visit patreon.com/Paulick Report and become a Paulick Report Insider today.